Twisted Metal Harbor City is something that interests me a lot more than it really should, being a piece of lost media at this point, now that its most recent build was dug up and became playable for anyone, thanks to people who have the hand of Christ apparently. Anyone is able to experience at least the groundwork of what a player could expect if this were to release. Today, I wanted to talk about the aura of Harbor City, what potential this game may have, would this entry have elevated Twisted Metal to new heights, or failed completely. We'll take a look at everything here, some theories on what would have happened, and general ideas for the fabled Twisted Metal Harbor City. If you aren't aware, briefly put, Harbor City is the cancelled sequel to Twisted Metal Black. People think this game was cancelled due to horrific events, but there weren't any. There were no plane crashes, no one got incinerated, it was just cancelled. That plane crash narrative is still being passed around to this very day. It is not true. Twisted Metal Harbor City was cancelled due to executives not feeling like a game could succeed in a quote post-GTA world without an on-foot section. Which is understandable if this series was competing with GTA, but GTA is a completely different type of game than Twisted Metal ever has been. If anything, most people compare Twisted Metal to a fighting game when there's nothing else to put next to it. The only similarity with GTA is being able to drive a car. Each and every other aspect have their own distinct flavor or intrigue that would make someone be a fan of each respective franchise. GTA is an open world sandbox game. Twisted Metal is an arcade arena brawler game, I guess you could say. The experiences are completely different from one another. So canceling Harbor City because of no on-foot section is like saying, oh, we can't release our new hot platformer game because Battlefield exists and games cannot exist without guns in it, where the only similarity between the two is how the player can fucking move. You could put so many asinine comparisons here to show how absurd this situation actually is when looking at the titles side by side. Just a very mundane reason for anything to be scrapped, especially when it's this far in development. Some presume the entire situation to be a tax write-off, which could be the real reason, honestly. It makes a lot more sense. So when it comes to the actual game, at this point, surely most people have tested out this bad boy. If not, I will have a link in the description for Harbor City's most recent build. Anyone who has played this, or even looked at it, could tell you the core game is probably like 60 to 70% done. We can see there are fully finished models for characters, most have working specials, levels are textured, there's outlines of destructibility in them, and then if you look at some of the features brought forward in the other modes we have available, there's a clear indicator of how much this game was going to bring when it comes to innovating and adding interesting things for this franchise overall to make a very enticing game for players to try out. Bringing to light an idea that was initially birthed back during the original Twisted Metal game's development, which is connecting all of the levels together, creating one large map. Players could drive around all of the levels on their own accord. Ironically, similar to GTA is what Jaffe compared the idea to, but they ended up scrapping it since they couldn't do anything more than having all the enemies at once on a giant map with nothing else for the player to do. They inevitably needed to be cut down to what we know from the series now, that being arena maps ranging from small to large for players to battle on. Harbor City wanted to bring that idea back, which we can fully experience here. In the most recent build, there are no issues with the functionality in that regard. Players are able to go from place to place using highways that connect levels together. After defeating the enemies in your location, you move on to the next one, creating continuous action for one to experience. For some odd reason, you can also go back to the previous level you just finished whenever you want to. Now, I don't know if this would have been changed in a fully released version, since you were able to do this in the middle of a current level while the enemies are still around. It does help in the sense of letting players grab weapons without being disturbed, but would also be very, very exploitable. If they really decided to let players do this, I feel like the experience of it would be heavily dependent on how much life is actually going on inside the cities. Maybe adding some sort of side objectives for bonus weapons, similar to the minigame feature that was added into Twisted Metal Head-On. Since they wanted to make the game a little bit more open, having these options would be interesting, like some sort of murderous type of side mission could be fine, or even blowing up a structure. Vigilante 8 had a system like that with objectives, so bringing that over wouldn't hurt or take you out of the game. Destruction in a car combat title helps add to the overall vibe of what you're doing. I do think the overall idea idea is really interesting depending on how it was executed. They also could have utilized this mechanic to make boss fights a lot more extravagant throughout a tournament playthrough, iterating upon what Black started, possibly creating some sort of multi-phased boss fight that requires you to travel around each location to defeat a phase for it. I'm not sure how this would play out since we have seen bigger bosses come and they were kind of stinkers. I'm just tossing out some ideas for this situation. Regardless if this played poorly or not, the attempt at innovation with how a tournament run would play out is something to appreciate rather than them just sticking with the same tired old loop we experienced for years and years prior, which was not an uncommon thing for the early 2000s. That seemed to be a time period where companies were trying new things out with games, taking some sort of risk. My personal favorite being the implementation of Conquest Mode in Mortal Kombat, becoming a universally praised thing people would love to see even come back now. If they didn't take that risk, well, no one would have been able to experience it. The entire ideology behind Harbor City appeared to be a risk, which is something that just needs to be done when you've been doing the same thing for over 6 years at this point. While obviously keeping that formula of core car combat gameplay Twisted Metal is known for, coming up with new ways for that to become more engaging is nothing to scoff at. We of course don't know exactly what the team was planning overall when it comes to how everything would play out besides the larger levels and presumably more exhilarating bosses. I wish we did have some backstories on these sorts of things from one of the developers. Unfortunately, we don't, so we are stuck speculating on gameplay features. Another thing I really would have hoped for is having larger battles, at least when you consider the size of the levels and depending on how many characters the PS2 hardware could handle at once, allowing the player to have a massive fight with a multitude of enemies. Say if we could fit 12 enemies on a level, for the time, that would have been an all-out war to experience. In this earlier build here, we can play up to 7 at a time. I'm not sure if that's pushing the PS2 limits already. Black could have up to 8. If it was possible, that would be a great thing to see, even if it was for just level 1 to create a memorable tournament-like aura, giving off a similar vibe as Twisted Metal 1's first level, just in a different light. That game had a small arena, 1v1, having posters hung up like everyone signed up to participate in that battle. Here, we'd see all the contestants who showed up day 1 ready to participate in whatever shit show would come out of this situation. Harbor City could have exacerbated the outright chaos and destruction caused by this tournament, allowing for more enemies to be fought at once. I think this would be a really good idea for a first level. Seeing more things to make the tournament stand out, which would be the biggest takeaway for me, even just looking at the level transitions alone. I think that is an important factor that's sort of overlooked, is how in these games, the tournament and deathmatch aren't really differentiated from each other well enough. Sure, you fight a boss and you get an ending in a tournament, but the core experience is identical. In Harbor City, I felt like this could have finally created the divide, actually making me play both modes, since I literally never touched deathmatch ever, outside of needing footage for a particular thing, which is a specific circumstance not many will be doing anyways. Or I guess if I wanted to do something stupid like putting a bunch of club kids in a room together or battling 7 Sweet Teeth in Twisted Metal 4, here a tournament playthrough could have given us a unique taste of innovation, testing stuff out like more grandiose battles, boss fights, level transitioning, and whatever other ideas the development team had, while deathmatch could be the mode that gives us the expected fighting in a smaller arena, going against an allotted amount of opponents. As long as there would be a good amount of customization options, which is something that the 989 games did great for the time period. I always hoped that would be iterated upon, but it just sadly never was. I feel this would give a true balance to Harbor City, a newer style and an older style mixed into one package for people to play and hopefully enjoy. When it comes to the cutscenes in the tournament mode, with the game being a sequel to Black, surely there would be expectations for it to meet that 3-act story people loved so much from there. Personally, I don't really care about this from Harbor City because of the Hood Classic part we're going to talk about next. As long as we were given something with the quality of Twisted Metal Head On, since that entry had stupendous voice acting, that would work for an ending for me. There were a couple from Black that could have had more added to them. A perfect example is Manslaughter. His ending was abrupt and random, so bringing a real conclusion would be nice to see. Then having quality endings for whatever new characters and other characters that were brought back into this colorful darkness world that this title was going to portray would probably be the best thing. having stuff that is lighthearted and stupid than downright insane, where hopefully the real story would aid in fleshing this whole situation out. Now, when it comes to the real story, is what I'm gonna call it, this is the first opportunity we would have had to get an actual story mode following the path of a character, that character being Needles Kane. Twisted Metal Black laid down the groundwork to create a fantastic story base going forward due to the ideologies behind it. Granted, the stretches people take to say the stories are the best thing ever with being inside of Sweet Tooth's mind is a bit ridiculous. If the guy who wrote the story said himself it was done at the very end while he was sick, not putting that much thought into it, obviously the game was not made having this design philosophy in mind, and any connections brought forth would be coincidences or stretches, unless, you know, Needles is specifically there or referenced. Hearing Jaffe spill the beans on this sort of pulls the intrigue out for me, but I guess you can do nothing but applaud those said people who find a fat roll under a character's breast and say this somehow relates to Sweet Tooth's inner weight gain battle, and when the ending rolls around, it's about his personal demon to stop being the person who took that cookie from the cookie jar. Obviously, a player at face value isn't going to know the truth behind this unless they've watched interviews with David Jaffe, but when I heard that from him, it's like being told as a kid Santa isn't real. It just ruins the whole mystique and essence of it. But this does not mean the premise is not a really good one. Living inside of a serial killer's head is honestly a great concept that hasn't really been explored to my knowledge. There are plenty of avenues that can be taken with how an entire world and story gets depicted, hence the endless amounts of theories and fun people have had with Black's world. Harbor City could have been the opportunity for us to drive the whole point home and structure the actual story that is solely based around Needles Kane himself, while also being able to bring validity to some of those fan theories. Sticking those things in would surely spike interest higher for the story and get some community involvement. And of course, community involvement is wishful thinking on my end, especially from a game that was supposed to release in the early 2000s. But some stories fans have created are pretty logical or unique about Twisted Metal Black, so it could work. In Harbor City, we are given an idea of what this whole situation could have looked like in the very first mission of the On Foot section, beginning a story where Needles is waking up in the prison, which we tried to escape from. He goes ballistic, annihilating all the guards with various weapons found on the walls, inevitably breaking out, going to find his long-lost truck. After escaping, he's being chased by the cops in their cruisers and helicopters, slowly making his way from area to area. Unfortunately, we cannot really make anything serious of this because the game is not done and our cutscene enjoyment is a placeholder black screen with text on it, or hilariously watching helicopters crash and cause a massive scene with no sound at all. We can only live in make pretend land of what is actually going on here. If I had to guess, they would 100% use the all in Needles head situation, since it easily could have been built off of. My idea would be them saying all of Black was living through Sweet Tooth's head while he was in the prison about to be executed in, quote, the real world, or if you wanted to play off the Minion ending, calling it the colorful world, either one works. And Harbor City would begin right after he is awoken, also giving a logical reason to why the game's color palette is more vibrant. Something that confused me initially, since with Black, everything is all dark and dingy, which I don't personally care for the truck stop bathroom color palette, but from an artistic standpoint, it makes sense to why everything looks that way. With Harbor City, they seem to be going with a mixture of the Twisted Metal Black gothic style and Twisted Metal 2's vibrancy, which most likely would have been a fantastic thing to see as a finished product. Judging from what we are able to view from the level designs, they did a great job blending the two, and it could have been easily explained from a story perspective as well, making it much less of a whiplash coming from Twisted Metal Black. I really would have loved to have seen them take the great premise Twisted Metal Black had and truly added to the whole situation, creating a real story and adding to the world for players to enjoy. It would have been the perfect opportunity to build a story for the series going forward, because as I said with Black's story, that game wasn't created with being inside of Needle's head from the beginning. All the theories and things people stretch together for the stories are just that, theories. I would love to see a real story built from the bottom up about this guy, but sadly, we may never live in that world. I'm sure you're aware when it comes to the story mode, this whole on foot section was implemented in last minute due to the big bad GTA, This was their attempt to save Harbor City as a project towards the end of development, where it was inevitably cancelled, following the legendary quote of "games without an on-foot section will not succeed in a post-GTA world." It is quite apparent how little time got stuck into these missions compared to the car combat portion, since that aspect is a lot closer to being completed, and this was just shoved in hopes of preventing cancellation. Looking at the potential of all of it is exciting, but you also need to look at the other half of the glass, which is the possibility of it being awful. This mode genuinely could have been a worry if Harbor City were to release. Looking at the level designs, most of them are just straight pathways besides level 1 and the last level that was barely started. I'm not sure if anything would have been added in to create a memorable gameplay experience with this, unless it was turned into a beat-em-up of sorts, which is doubtful. Funnily enough, I think a mode where you're just running around as Sweet Tooth killing a bunch of people doesn't even sound like a bad time, so if they did that, maybe it could have worked. Unfortunately, I just don't think they would. Regardless of how they handled it though, I feel like most would probably view this as a very gimmicky mode, like play it once and never touch it again, so they'd probably focus more on world building and a story, which I think a lot of Twisted Metal Black fans most likely would have wanted more than anything else. This team would have had plenty to work with when it comes to Needles Kane. There are so many iterations of him, they could take little aspects of each of them and put them all into one character, similar to the TV show, instead of him just being the clown man who murdered family. Needles is one of the most iconic characters in the gaming lexicon, so it would have been nice to see him be fleshed out more and given a more grandiose backstory. Unfortunately, we just couldn't get that. There is a lot to talk about with this game. We could go on for so long about various details littered throughout what we can play, and also theorize what this game's potential was. The most gripping part of Harbor City for me is honestly just how the title was going against the grain. You can see the positive and negative potential with it. Yes, like this game could have been a disaster, like seriously. If the tournament flowed horribly, if the story mode was boring, and the actual story itself was poorly done, we could be looking at a train wreck of a game here. On the other hand, we could have a game with great diversity never before seen in the franchise, creating a captivating tournament mode that changed how people viewed the series, allowing a true story to be built, following Needles Kane, building upon what Black started, making players view the character in a completely different light. I see this as the title that would have been either one of the best in the series or one of the worst, honestly. There are so many arguments that could be made for either side for it being horrible or being amazing. But even though it didn't release, the game is still fun to talk about and make theories for due to this and how everything would play out, so I guess that says something. So with all of this said, do you think Harbor City would have been a piece of junk or an amazing game? As always, make sure to leave all of your thoughts and theories in the comments below.